Hey guys, Cliff Gray here with True Hunts and Flat Tops Wilderness Guides. Today I'm going to go over feed sources for bear, deer, and elk in the western states and in the Rocky Mountains, okay? So you're going to see me talk about different food sources for bears throughout the video. It's kind of scattered as I go through the different categories of vegetation, but that'll be useful to you bear hunters out there so you'll know where to focus, okay? During the fall season, you're gonna know what those bears are focusing on. And you can hunt where there's big chunks of that type of vegetation. The deer and elk stuff I go over is also going to be helpful to you in the same way. During your scouting, you'll be able to identify those plants, and then come fall, you're going to know when and where to be, what types of vegetation to focus on. So I hope that's helpful to you. Right off the bat, I'm going to recommend 2 books. This one's a little bit hard to get. It's Winter Guide to Central Rocky Mountain Shrubs. Okay, it's an older book. The thing that's nice about this is most of the pictures are without vegetation on all these browse species. And that's very helpful because in the fall or in the early spring when you're maybe out getting some time to get some scouting in, but fall when you're hunting, a lot of the vegetation is going to be off these plants. So this is a good book for identification under those situations. And then Shrubs and Trees of Southwest Uplands. This has some very good illustrations in it and is a good supplement to the winter guide to shrubs. All right, so those are 2 books that I recommend. So let's go over some quick overarching theories when it comes to bear, deer, and elk feed. So first we'll talk about bears. All right, so what bears are going to eat is very dependent on the year. All right, what I find is they're going to first in the fall focus on acorns, okay, if they can. So if the Gamble's oak has set good acorn crop, focus on that and focus on hunting that. If there's not a good consistent acorn crop, focus on your bottom country that has good thick runs of chokecherry, and then it'll have some intermittent dispersed serviceberry. All right, if both of those are not going off, you're gonna have to hunt country that's got serviceberry, and generally those are gonna be your roughest fall hunting conditions for bears. But you need to be able to identify serviceberry because you need to know where it's thick. And the same thing for these other species. A bear, if he's got access to a lot of different feed sources, he's going to find an area where it has the best economics for him, right? So the biggest acorns in the highest density, the biggest chokecherries in the most intense thick run of chokecherries. All right, that's what you want to focus on. Serviceberry is widely dispersed, but one hillside it might have one plant for per 50, 60 feet in very little berries. And then in other areas, it might have 30 plants every 40 feet, right? And they all have berries, okay? And that's gonna vary by elevation. It's gonna vary a little bit as the season goes too, right? Like things ripen throughout the season based on elevation. So you've gotta know what you're looking at. All right, so on deer and elk, what you're gonna find is they do have a big difference in feeding behavior. Elk are more like cattle in the sense that they will graze on grasses. So like in meadows, they'll eat mature grasses like this stuff, even this old stuff, and you'll find an elk eating this. A deer you will not, okay? And so deer are focused on more highly nutritious, forbs, clovers, those sort of items when you're talking about meadows and grazing, all right? Elk will surely eat just grasses. And so the other thing is elk have a smaller chunk of their diet is going to be true browse. So in layman terms, browse is basically bushes, all right? Deer key in on those bushes and that browse because it's highly nutritious. Both the stems, the new growth stems, that palatable little tasty stuff, and the leaves and flowers, those are more nutritious than grasses. So the reason there's this difference has to do with their digestive tract. Elk have bigger stomach compartments, a bigger digestive tract, more like cattle. So they can consume and get nutrition out of a wider range vegetation, including grasses, which are readily available in most places, all right? Deer have a more compact digestive system, so they have to focus on browse and forbs that has high nutritional value. So you're gonna see that difference. And because of that, in terms of livestock, and this is good to know if you're hunting forest land, sheep are more similar to deer in the sense they're gonna focus on forbs and browse, and then cattle are more competitive directly with elk, okay? Because they're gonna eat grasses. Sometimes you can see a little benefit when there's cattle grazing in an area, sometimes for deer to an extent, because the cattle will come in, or if there's a heavy, migratory elk population, they'll come through and they'll wipe out those grasses and they'll get them low, and then a nice little supple grass will come back, little forbs will come back, and the deer will come in there and focus on that, okay? So sometimes there can be there's some complementary aspects there. But there's also the flip side of it. Cattle can compete with elk on the grasses, and then the elk will move to the forbs and the browse, and then therefore now the elk are more heavily competing with the deer. So it's all a happy medium. None of it's bad, none of it's good. It's all about management practices, but it's good for you as a hunter to know what affects what. So you don't, if you see cattle, you don't just say, oh, my hunt's over. Or if you see a lot of elk and you're, those different dynamics, you gotta realize that under different circumstances, they play together a different way in terms of this vegetation. So anyways, that's the introduction and the overarching concepts. I hope this video is useful to you. I try to go through each plant, show you the plant, tell you when deer and elk and bears are using it. And I hope all that information is useful to you guys. I think it's just cool to know what the species is eating and getting in their head a little bit and understanding their life. And a big part of all three species is food sources. So knowing that knowledge is going to make you a better hunter. So I hope this is helpful to you guys. Good luck out there. All right, guys, so here we're looking at chokecherry, and I'll cut a piece off and show you some identifying marks of it, but I wanted to show you just from a little bit of distance that chokecherry can grow like a tree. Like you can see here, I mean, this chokecherry is, that big around, and that's not uncommon in this part of Colorado, and I've seen that in Utah and other places too. And it can actually even get bigger where it looks like even more of a tree. Some people even dry that out and burn it. So it can be a tree, or it can look more like brush, right? And it can be like this in stands huge stands of it that's only, thigh deep, and it looks completely different than it does when it's kind of more in its tree form, right? It's obviously a function of age, but it's also just a function of where it is. Some places I notice it just doesn't grow beyond this distance, or beyond this size, excuse me. So let me show you, if I can on the camera, one identifying marker of it, because there's a lot of other vegetation that does kind of look like it. So if you look here, hopefully I can get that there. If you look at the base of the leaf right here, you're gonna see two dots, okay? They almost look like little pimples, okay? And that is an identifier of chokecherry, all right? Obviously, the other identifier is the actual cherries on it. In this case, this is springtime, so there's no fruit on the chokecherry plant, but you can see here the form where it grows, how it grows berries. I'll give you a close-up of that too. Hopefully you can see that. And so the berries are gonna set just like that, okay? And when they actually set the fruit, I mean, they can get lengths of berry that are like this long. And so in terms of browse and what eats this, I don't see elk in it very much at all. I do see mule deer in it, particularly in the summertime. They eat the new growth, they eat the leaves. I've even seen them eat the berries, all right? I wouldn't say that it's, at least in the mule deer populations I've hunted over the years, I wouldn't say it's like a preferred browse or feed for them. But for bears it is, particularly when there's not a good acorn crop set, okay? If there's not good acorns on the Gamble oak, generally this is going to be the food source that I key in on when I'm bear hunting, okay? And I find that bears tend to like this might be slightly tall for them, but they prefer this over the short stuff. And I think it's probably because when they're feeding, they have some cover and protection, okay? But what I'm looking for when I'm looking for bears in this stuff is a lot of times they'll be reaching up and you'll see them actually bend a branch over, and you're gonna get this type of movement. You know, the branch coming down, and you're gonna see branches flip up like that, and that's how you're gonna spot bears. But I'd say this right behind the acorns of Gamble's oak, this is gonna be in the Rocky Mountains a key bear food source. Mule deer, sometimes you'll see them in it, sometimes you won't. I feel like the up in the high country, they use it quite a bit in the summer, but I don't see them hitting it really hard. So, but anyways, that's chokecherry, very common across Colorado and the western states. All right, guys, so what you're seeing here is this is Serviceberry, all right? And I'll show you a quick look at the leaf. Here you go. This is like the spring, summer leaf on Serviceberry. And this is a fairly mature plant. This is, you know, it grows to this height, you know, overhead high for me. I'm 6 foot, okay? And a lot of times you'll find it in a little bit drier areas, you know, maybe at just, you know, belly button height, and it'll stay that length. And it sets a berry on it, and I would say that in most areas in Colorado, how much berry gets set on it is finicky, okay? It just depends on how much moisture there was that year, and then also depends on where it is. If it's down closer to water, this plant is actually right next to a creek here, it's gonna set more berries than as you go up higher altitude away from the water, all right? So it's real finicky in that regard. And then it grows, a lot of the time, the ground cover near it, you're gonna find a shorter berry plant called snowberry, all right? And this plant sometimes can also set fruit. And what I find for mule deer and elk, you'll see them browsing on this, but it's usually in the wintertime, it's usually on the new growth from the season before, right? So like late fall, you might find them browsing on it. To me, it's kind of like chokecherry for deer. It doesn't seem to be their preferred feed by any means. I do see them feeding on the snowberry a little bit more and kind of throughout the year. And I think that kind of varies where you're at. But again, neither of them seem to be a primary food source for deer or elk anytime during the year. They just kind of hit it as they go through. And a lot of times what you're gonna find is you're gonna find serviceberry, snowberry, Gamble's oak, and then maybe some of those drier browse plants like mountain mahogany and bitterbrush. You're gonna find them in a pretty, you know, similar area. So you'll find deer in there and they're feeding, and they'll hit a little bit of the serviceberry, a little bit of the snowberry, but really what they're hitting hard is gonna be the mahogany and the bitterbrush. On bears, they'll eat it, and a lot of times you'll find serviceberry really thick in bear shit. I don't find it's a really good food source as a hunter to key in on. It's almost like they hit it as they're going to thicker stuff like either acorns or chokecherry groves. But part of that is it's also more dispersed. So I've glassed up bears in it for sure, but it's usually in big, massive areas of it, and they're cruising through it and they're feeding on it. It's not like chokecherry where I can go focus in on a little grove and hunt that. So where I will focus on serviceberry is down in the bottom where it's intermittently dispersed within chokecherry. In that case, those can be very good sources for glassing up bears. So that's serviceberry. All right, guys. So I just wanted to give you another look at serviceberry. So this is a little bit lower plant and probably a little bit younger plant, and you're going to see that here is kind of where you're going to typically see it, and it's going to be intermixed. You're back here, you're going to see some Gamble's oak, and you're going to see some sagebrush, okay? You're going to see that a lot kind of as you transition into a more arid elevation. You're going to lose the serviceberry, and you're going to migrate in to sagebrush and more of the Gamble's oak. All right, guys, so here we're looking at a thicket of Gamble's oak. All right, so for deer and elk, you're gonna see them in this a lot, and usually it's because they're browsing on other vegetation that is established within Gamble's oak. With the exception of in the late winter, I have seen deer and elk both feeding on the new growth on Gamble's oak. Again, it's not a preferred browse by any means, but they will eat it. I think it's just low on the nutritional scale of things, so they avoid it if they can, but they will eat it. They do use it for cover, and mule deer will eat the acorns in the fall. I have seen them on acorns. I do notice that if a good acorn set comes in, if there's a lot of bears around, you're gonna see less deer. So I think part of that is that just deer are not gonna hang around with bears, but the other thing is bears are just more efficient at working the acorns than deer are, so they just outcompete them. But anyway, so this is Gamble's oak. This is I would say older oak, and you're gonna see that it varies. I mean, it can be you know, waist high all the way up to essentially tree size. These are, you know, this big around, and it's very easy to identify in the spring once it gets its vegetation. It still hasn't sprouted all its vegetation here, but here I'll show you the limb structure on it. Okay. So we covered deer and elk. On bears, this would be one of the primary types of vegetation that I hunt, particularly when the acorns have set really well. Bears are gonna hit it, and they're gonna hit it hard. What you're gonna find is not all Gamble's oak is created equal. It all depends on how much acorn they set and how big the acorns are they set. So when you're scouting for bear areas to glass in the fall, look for big, look for the oak is particularly setting large acorns, and you're gonna be better off. And that's usually near water. So tight canyons where big swaths of oak, of this Gamble's oak is right above water, but it's dry enough where it's growing. Because Gamble oak, it's not gonna grow down in the bottom like Serviceberry and Chokecherry will. It's always gonna grow in well-drained soil. So you're gonna find that above, in tight canyons. But if it's close to that water, it's generally gonna set really good acorns, and this can be phenomenal vegetation to kill bears in. And just like how I hunt chokecherry, generally bears are gonna like human height type of oak brush, and maybe even a little bit taller. I tend to see them a lot in. And what you're generally gonna see a bear do is he's gonna grab it and he's gonna be shaking it whenever he's feeding on it, and he'll pull it down, and that's the movement you're gonna see. Because if you're looking at this from above or across a canyon, it's very hard to see bears actually in the oak brush. You're generally gonna see that movement, and then you can key in on them. Sometimes, just as a tip, when you're hunting bears in oak brush on acorns, is if you're looking at a bear and you're trying to identify to make sure that she doesn't have cubs with her, so she's legal to harvest, or he, right? If you're trying to make that identification, look at these older chunks of oak brush, because what a sow will do sometimes is she'll kick very small cubs up those while she's feeding. So you want to glass into those high spots, and a lot of times you'll see a little bitty cub, and then you'll know that that's a sow with cubs, and you'll move on to go find another legal bear to harvest. So just keep that in mind. It's a little tip. I've seen it quite often. It's actually really cool to see that in the field, see those little bears up there playing. But anyways, that's Gamble's oak, and I hope. All right, guys, so this is sagebrush. Most of you are gonna be able to identify this. It's pretty easy to identify sagebrush, and it's all over the winter range in Colorado. There it is. And then, of course, it smells like beautiful sagebrush. So, the thing about sagebrush is in late fall and in the winter, it's actually very important to mule deer. A lot of people kind of downplay sagebrush, and I think that's because it's just in abundance in most places, right? But it does have the nutrition that deer need in the winter, and they do browse on it. Yeah, they will hit bitterbrush and mahogany with more selectivity than they will sagebrush, but deer and elk both do depend on sagebrush. You will find It's gonna be mixed with gamble oak, junipers and cedars, or junipers and cedars, same thing, but cedars or junipers, however you wanna call it. And then sometimes it'll be mixed with bitterbrush and mountain mahogany, but not always. Sagebrush is much more dominant than mountain mahogany and bitterbrush, so it will dominate those plants. Okay, so that's sagebrush. Oh, and the one thing about sagebrush is a lot of people associate sagebrush with deer that don't taste that good. And I think it's because that sometimes you can sense a little saginess off them in the meat. And I've actually noticed that with antelope too. I don't mind it. I actually think it's kind of an interesting flavor, but you will find that. And I think it gets a little convoluted with the fact that a lot of times big deer are killed in the sagebrush because they're getting killed during rut hunts. So you've got where you're eating a rutty mule deer and he's been eating sagebrush. So it might be more the fact that he's rutting than the sagebrush, why people don't like him, but it's a thing out there that you will hear. All right, guys, so let's talk willows. So typically when guys are talking about willow when it comes to deer, elk, browse, really what they're focusing on is high country mule deer, okay? So I'm gonna hit that first. Generally, the type of willow that you're looking for when you're hunting high country mule deer way up there above 11,000 feet is this stuff right here. This is at my waist, and I would say that's the maximum maturity that you're gonna find big deer in their feeding, okay? So mule deer, when they feed on this stuff, they focus on the little supple twigs, and they much prefer the short willows. When you get willows like this stuff, you can see right here. I think it's in the screen, might not be, but it's willow way up above your head. That stuff is worthless when you're talking about mule deer. Okay, so you've got to focus on the short stuff, and I'm gonna throw in mountain maple in there also. It grows in the same spots a lot of the time, and it's the same deal. It's got to be a certain size for mule deer in the alpine to really like it. You're gonna see this stuff the right size. Usually, 3-4 years, maybe up to 10 years after a burn or a big ripping snow slide. So in some topographies, and the flat tops is a perfect example, a lot of times in the high alpine basins, you're not gonna find the right type of willow. And the reason is we don't have snow slides to rip it out. And nowadays we don't have big fires to regenerate it, okay? So in the more rugged country in Colorado and other western states where there's big snow slides, a lot of times, 3-4 years after those snow slides rip through, that's gonna be primo high country mule deer stuff, okay? But it's all about the maturity and the size. It's gotta be below your waist, and honestly, it's best if it's the little stunted stuff that's below your knees, okay? Elk and moose, they will hit it when it's a little more mature. And they hit it in the alpine, and they also hit it in the winter range down in the low country. You'll see them down in the bottoms, particularly when it's a real severe winter. You'll see deer, elk, and moose hitting willow, okay? Anyways, here, I'll show you the leaves. There's willow, and there's variations of willow, okay? All right, and then this is mountain maple, and same deal, there's some variations of it, but a lot of times you're gonna see those two plants together, and they go about the same rules, basically. Maturity and size matters. All right, so that's your willows. All right, guys, so this is what most guys call a cedar. Sometimes it'll be called the juniper. And these poor bastards get no love. And it's not that they aren't essential for mule deer and elk habitat, but what it is that they've gotten where the ecosystem is in a place where junipers have they're taking up more than their fair share of the habitat in a lot of mule deer country. And the reason is that junipers / cedars evolved in a fire cycle, right? So really a juniper should never really get even this large, right? It should have burnt in its lifetime in order to get this, before it got this large. But with the current policy of fire suppression along a lot of mule deer range, what happens is junipers get large and then they kill all that good browse and even the little grasses and forbs that grow underneath them. and that affects the habitat. So when you look at a lot of elk and mule deer habitat restoration projects on private land and public land, a lot of it is centered around juniper mitigation. Okay, fire's the best, but what they use is these machines that pop them up and basically shred them and open up the country for that other browse, the sagebrush, the mountain mahogany, bitterbrush, all those little forbs and stuff in the spring to come up. Okay, so. But like I said, they are essential because they provide some cover for deer and elk, particularly in the winter range. There's other areas where they summer in pinyon juniper country. And again, this is really their only source of cover is these junipers because all the other vegetation you can see through, it's a little bit more sparse. So they do need it, they just need it at a lower level than what you're seeing right now. It doesn't mean if you see a lot of junipers that it's bad mule deer country. It probably means that the mule deer country used to be better. But if there's still ample amounts of other browse, it's no problem to hunt that country. Yeah, I have seen deer eating cedars in the winter, and what I've been told is the nutritional value is so low that if a deer focuses on eating this, they just won't survive. So it's almost like when you see deer eating cedars and junipers, deer or elk, it's probably because they're just trying to keep their bellies full, or it's a very small proportion of their diet, but it's not going to be a primary food source for them. But it is, you can associate it with a lot of other good browses are typically around it, as long as it's not taking over the topography and choking out all those other good browse and feed sources for deer and elk. And here's what the leaf looks like. Some people call it a needle. I don't actually know technically if it's a needle or a leaf, but it's usually flat. There's a bunch of different variations, and there's junipers that grow. There's a form of junipers that grow that are lower than knee high, and then there's this tree version. Both of those are pretty common in Colorado. The low one, I tend to see that where there's a higher canopy, like in timber and stuff like that. You'll see that lower one growing. In the more arid areas where there's oak and that sort of terrain, the southern exposures, I see these more tree type of junipers. So anyways, the other thing, a lot of times, I think I mentioned it, you'll actually hear juniper referred to PJ, and what they're talking about is they're talking about pinyon pine and juniper, okay? And so pinyon pines are usually more sparse than the juniper. Usually these juniper trees are what's dominating what people call PJ. All right, guys, just to focus on the forb / grasses that I mentioned in the introduction and the differences between deer and elk. Generally, like in this feed here, the deer are gonna solely focus on this type of stuff, okay? Most people are gonna associate this type of material, kind of like a grass, but it's got a broadleaf. You know, a clover is, you know, what a lot of people are gonna call it. Those sort of forbs are gonna be what a deer focuses on and needs, okay? It will eat, mule deer will eat these little grasses, you know, probably to about that length. But after that, they're too mature for the deer to process and get enough nutritional value out. You will see deer, or you will see elk eat grasses that are far beyond this growth level. And the reason is their stomach and their whole digestive system is large enough to get the nutritional value out of more mature grasses, okay? But the deer are always gonna focus on these little forbs when you're in meadows and that sort of thing, okay? They're gonna have some broadleafs on them, clovers, you know, alfalfa is obviously a preference for all these animals, those sort of things. But you know, the bunch grasses when they're small are great for deer, but really as they mature, they're really an elk feed. And that is a significant difference. When you see old feed like this, that's dry in meadows, this is generally not good for either species, okay? It doesn't have any value for deer or elk. And a matter of fact, it tends to be a sign that the area is undergrazed, okay? So if you're in an area that maybe has a little cattle grazing on the forest, a little sheep grazing or whatever, but usually cattle is what we're talking about when we're talking about grasses. If you see this, where there's mature grasses, it means there's not enough cattle or there's not enough elk. okay? Because this mature grass is not getting consumed, and then it lays over dead, and it affects the growth of these little forbs that are very nutritious for mule deer, okay? So always be wary of this theory out there that all grazing is bad. If there's a low number of elk in an area, it doesn't necessarily mean that the cattle are consuming, you know, all the goods out there, okay? Because if the cattle ate this in this situation, you know, I would prefer there's just elk, but let's say it's cattle for whatever management reasons. If they ate that, then there would be more of this for our mule deer. And elk will eat that stuff too. It's obviously more nutritious, so they'll eat it. So anyways, hopefully that kind of gives you a little bit better idea on grasses and forbs. Hey guys, so this is mountain mahogany, this brush right here, okay? And it's a very common browse food source for mule deer in Colorado and the other western states. And I would say in mule deer terminology, this stuff is the shit, okay? This is what they're gonna focus on if they can. This and bitterbrush that I'll show you next, all right? And so when you look at an assortment of vegetation that's sage, Gamble's oak, rabbitbrush, those, you know, that sort of terrain, some scattered junipers in there. If you have mountain mahogany groves, you're gonna find that the deer and elk focus on that. They eat the little leaves during the springtime, kind of when they're transitioning. In summer, generally they don't focus on it. They'll be focusing on grasses and forbs, both species, deer and elk. But then back during the hunting season in the fall, during that transitionary phase, they're gonna be back on it and eating it. And they're gonna focus on the little twigs and that little browse that's palatable to them, and they can eat and get a ton of nutrition out of, okay? The way that I tell it apart from bitterbrush is that it has more of a leaf, whereas a bitterbrush kind of has a defined B if you turn it parallel to the ground. I'll show you that when I show you bitterbrush, but here is mountain mahogany here. Okay, so what I'm showing you here is this is a more browsed version of it. You can see that it's stumpy, okay? It's stumpy, and that's from the pressure that deer and elk have put on it. And it's basically those deer and elk are eating that new growth off of it every year and keeping it browsed down and more stumpy. In areas where elk are a little bit overpopulated, a lot of times you'll see that to the extreme, where the mountain mahogany only gets, you know, knee high, and it's really stunted. It almost gets like a much more woody look to it. And so this is more of a mountain mahogany branch that hasn't been heavily browsed, okay? The leaves are more spread out. It's a thinner profile on the branches, all right? So the other identifying factor on mountain mahogany is, unfortunately right now I don't have it, but the flower, whenever it matures through the summer and fall, it almost looks like a little feather. And when you see it, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But I would say that mountain mahogany is so preferred by deer and elk that if during your scouting you see it, and you see it in thick little groves, it tends to be patchy. A lot of places, I mean, you'll go, you know, a mile or, you know, 800, 900 yards, and you won't see any of it in that south-facing sagebrush, oak brush country, and then all of a sudden you'll hit a big patch of it. It's good to remember where those are, because in the fall, the deer and elk are gonna go back there and hit them, okay? All right, so that's mountain mahogany, good stuff. All right, guys, so I'm gonna show you bitterbrush real quick. And generally, bitterbrush is gonna grow in proximity to mountain mahogany. So here you can see this is mountain mahogany, and then this is bitterbrush here. Bitterbrush tends to be less woody, kind of per square inch, it has more leafy material. And like I said about mountain mahogany, this is like a primo feed for deer. If you can find a lot of bitterbrush, you're gonna find it's gonna be very good deer and elk habitat. But deer in particular, they key in on this stuff in mountain mahogany like it's like candy. So if you need to really know how to identify it. This plant here, this kind of shows you the structure of it. Real bushy, lots of stem material. And then on the outside, I'll just pop a piece off here. You can kind of see how it grows there, okay? All right, now, what I just showed you is the leaves just starting to grow. So it doesn't really show you what I consider the identifying feature of bitterbrush, and that's when you turn it parallel to the ground, it has a bee type of shape, right? Like a bee, okay? And it's pretty defined. So I'm gonna show you in a mature leaf what I mean in this book. All right. Hopefully you can see that right there. If not, I'll take a picture of it. But the leaves right here, okay? So you can see that bee shape, all right? Okay, that's a defining feature of Bitterbrush. And the other way you can always tell it from mountain mahogany is one, I mean, you'll just get where you can identify the structure of the plant. But the other thing is mountain mahogany has a feather-like seed and Bitterbrush doesn't. It more has like a little flower, set of flowers that pops out. These are old ones from last year, but that kind of gives you the idea. So anyways, guys, that's Bitterbrush. Hey guys, so this is rabbitbrush, and you'll see the distinguishing feature is the top here, these flowers. And this is early spring, so they don't look like they do later on. Later on, they actually have like a pretty yellowish, sometimes like an orangish color, and it's very distinct. You'll see rabbitbrush a lot of times on the side of roadways, and that's because rabbitbrush takes advantage of soil that's been disturbed, okay? And it tends to take over in those situations. Rabbitbrush, for whatever reason, doesn't get a lot of love. I've heard biologists say that it has very little food value to mule deer and elk. But I can tell you from my experience, I've actually seen mule deer in particular key in on it when the flowers are real tender. I've actually seen big mule deer bucks just work patches of it and just eat the flower. And through research, I've actually found that it's actually considered pretty high quality browse for deer and elk. You know, in the transition times, in the spring migration as they go up higher, and also in the fall and then into the winter, it's a pretty good food source. I think it's just abundant, and then kind of like junipers, it tends to take over if there's not a mitigating factor, so it doesn't get much love. But particularly up high, if you find little patches of it, you might remember those sections and watch for deer. Whenever those flowers are real bright and they're real pretty, you'll see those deer come along and they'll just nip the flowers. So it must be of some value to them because they're pretty picky eaters. So anyways, that's rabbitbrush.